Hello, I'm Sora Lexon, and this is Lebronomancy or Incense Scrying Part 2. Last time I went over everything incense scrying isn't, more or less, how it doesn't work, and of course, the worthiness of universal meditative states and the questions involved therein, whether by incense scrying or any other form of high, occulted meditative thinking and ritual work. Not so much thinking, but real meditation and ritual works. Let's say that you understand all of that, that you do work to get into a full trance state. Again, always ritualistically in your safe space first. I should mention one of the easiest forms of Lebronomancy is to daily make an incense offering. Just a simple offering on a daily basis to burn incense to come into closer communion with the spiritual, with the air element, and with your ability to interact in communion with everything beyond the veil. To just burn incense as an offering on a daily basis and make that part of your routine is one of the simplest forms of Lebronomancy, one of the most practiced. Even though it isn't direct scrying, if the intention, the subconscious intention is your understanding, your comprehension, that doing so is going to bring you into closer communion with spiritual information, then that is going to happen. So even though it seems like a passive thing, it isn't really. You see this a lot in Buddhism with joss sticks, burning incense as an offering, and also just as a daily way of reminding oneself of communication with the spiritual and opening those doorways. So that's probably the easiest form. But let's say you're going for something a little more advanced, a little more specific. You need to be in a safe space first. Lebronomancy, like Nismancy, like all other magical work, when you're scrying, it must be treated with the utmost respect. And that includes full ceremony and symbolic ritual become realistic reality. In layman's terms, always cast your circle first. However you do that, whatever your method is, and be in full control and preparedness. And be in a safe space. Don't just go thinking you can wave an incense stick around after breakfast while you sit unprotected in front of a television or something. That's not a good idea. Full ritual, full circle casting, and then at the appropriate time with your personal ceremonies, enter a trance state, and then attempt your Libromancy. First, heads up, there's, again, different kinds of incense scrying. You have shape and structural, you have movement-based, you have scent-based, you have audio-based. Quick breakdown with, resin or loose herb, stick or cone, you can draw actual figures out of the smoke to interact with visually. Forms that are fed and created by the smoke. That is a fairly high level of magic. It is a form of smoke scrying because it requires incense for the purpose of divination. But it's also more than just simple divination because you're actually relying not on the smoke, but on the energy that's being fed by it. Needless to say, remember to cast your circle and feel free to deny access to anything that you simply aren't ready to interact with before ever beginning. Especially if you're trying to use the smoke visually and don't want some lovely, pesky offering eater jumping around in your smoke, doing backflips, making faces at you and stuff while you're trying to use it. That makes it tough to interpret. So if you're after an energy presenting itself by use of offering it smoke to give it, form an interactive being here on the physical plane, you have a lot more research to do than just this video beforehand. Because it is a form of smoke scrying and it also is not. If you're doing that, best to use thick, high-quality offerings. If that's the kind of libronomancy you're attempting. So next, you have shape or movement based. In much the same way, but without an entity provocateur. So you can burn incense, again, resin, loose, cone, stick, herbal incenses, shakers, whatever works best for you. Witches tend towards herbs directly on coals in a reading censer that's been consecrated for that purpose. Pythia liked to feed the incense smoke to herself and her snake, the python. Priests tend towards stick incense. Monks and shamans tend towards cones, brush, woven sticks, a lot of different forms of clearing woods. Whatever works for you creates the best experience and smoke for you. Whatever feels right, use that. Cone incense and censer herbs tend to burn faster and hotter, just so you know. That if that needs to play into your decision-making process, they burn faster than sticks. They also dump a lot of smoke in the air faster as well, if that's the effect you're after. So take that into consideration. Personally, I tend towards stick incense. It's part of my ritual traditional background in Hermetic magic that's been handed down to me, and I try to respect my craft in that way. But it also gives me the time I need to really not feel rushed in what I'm doing. Stick incense burns a long time, and so if I tend to wander, I'm not always having to rush back in order to finish a ritual. I also find it much easier to control stick incense as a tool of my craft. I make my own, and of course, if you've seen my shop, you know that I try to make what I can available to others as well. I am very picky. I am very decisive about my incense and when I use it and how, and planetary correspondences. Cones and herbs on coals aren't always easy to quench on command. So a stick of incense, again, this is why I tend towards it. Even multiple sticks, those are very easy to put out promptly if it's necessary. And there could be all sorts of reasons it's necessary. They're also very simple to move around if necessary. But that's just me. You do you. If you like loose scattered herb incense on a giant 5-foot coal burning brazier, you do that. So with shape, movement, scrying in the smoke, you're looking to create, again, in your ritual meditative state, a bond with that smoke. You're using it almost as an avenue, an uplink mentally. You're going to observe and interpret the incense smoke, but from a place beyond yourself. So it's not just, oh, it curled 3 times, or it looks kind of like this object that I've seen before. When you're communing with the air element in a very pure way, you will read the smoke like language. You have to wait patiently for whatever communications might come to you while deeply scrying. That's true of all scrying. If you've seen 300 with the Spartan king, and he climbs to the oracle heights to receive the prophecy, yes, that girl writhing around in the smoke, mumbling in hushed, broken, not quite lucid whispers of lions and bulls and limbs. That's what you're aiming for with movement, libromancy scrying with incense smoke. Just without the drugs or necessarily the nudity and the writhing around. I think they must have filmed that underwater, because what she's actually doing is swimming, and I think they must have removed water post-edit in that film. But you know what I mean. If you've seen this movie or just want to like look up this scene on YouTube, you know what I'm talking about here. And you can do it without, nudity and, tossing your head back in orgasmic ecstasy. You might be feeling that internally, but you don't have to display it externally. Or if you're into that, hey, if it helps you, go for it. If you have your own temple and you have a sacred space and it's completely private and you're sitting there in the dark in your smoke and you want to do that, you do you. But I would admonish against any drug influence during smoke scrying. It's just going to muddy the waters. From my own background, I can tell you that all forms of magic are either you have the complete capability for them without drug use. Remember, would-be ceremonial magicians, anything you can do with biochemical feedback, with organic ingestion or inhalation, like DMT, for instance, you can also fully induce that exact state correspondence and mental travel without it by just using your mind with enough training and magical prowess and with far less damage. True story. But by all means, go naked and arched back trance new age dance if you want, if it helps. Usually it does. Remember, magic is a demanding lover. You have to woo her. The more ritual and ceremony, the better. The oracles of Delphi, Pythia, there's been a few oracles, but one would sit on a stone throne above a vast chasm of smoke, a fracture in the actual earth, in the mountain underground in this cave that exhaled, vapors into this space. And she would, at great risk, bathe in this smoke above this rupture in the ground, this chasm. And that ritual of ceremony in that way, in order to come into communion with the divine and then give prophecies. Aim for that. But without the semi-active volcano directly beneath you, when you are engaging in smoke scrying, you are becoming the oracle. Whether it's to advise another or yourself doesn't matter. And as you can see, it's a lot more involved and it takes a great deal more training, which can be done totally by yourself. It could be self-training, but it takes a great deal more work and skill gained to give true smoke scrying readings than just, the incense curled or the ashes burned and curled, and that means fertility, or it went out half the way down or moved left or right, and that means, the sun won't survive the battle. That's not authentic magic. So when you're engaging in smoke scrying, you are becoming the prophesier, right? Whether it's to advise someone else or ask questions on your own behalf, it's the same thing. Same trance state, same link with the smoke has to be formed to open yourself up to higher spiritual communications. And I say spiritual as a code word. I've discussed that before, code words inside of magic and inside of literature. It's a quick definition. Connecting to the energies and information you're seeking would be a lengthier way to put it. In genuine scrying, you're opening yourself up to the other side. And that's why you won't see it recorded for public viewing. You're not going to find a YouTube video of a real oracle or talked about in websites accurately. If you just search incense smoke scrying, incense divination, you're not going to find this. Because like all magic, it is a deeply personal, sacred, and vulnerable act that requires great training, great skill, and devotion to your craft, and a very safe space, a hallowed space that isn't actively being shared with the public to work within. What you're aiming to do with true smoke scrying is to let your mind be non-linear, to allow it to be flexible enough, like air, to interact with and then usefully see the purest form of truth. That's not a small task. It's not if the coals pop twice when I add the leaves, the answer is no. And it's certainly not if the incense keeps going out, it means I'm weak, or whatever well-meaning but damaging nonsense dabblers put out there. It isn't that. And that's why you're not going to see true oracle incense scrying anywhere being videotaped, filmed, and somebody's sitting there selfieing it with their camera. It's not going to happen. Even if you know what you're doing, seeking these forms of interaction and communication to scry, you always have to bear in mind that the truth is obvious and present. That's not the problem. But sometimes the scales will, with the help of magic, fall from your eyes just long enough to glimpse that genuine, authentic truth. The problem is our delusion of being cut off from it, our obfuscation between it and us. Magic lets those scales drop, maybe enough to glimpse what's actually going on. But then the vessel you're in, the conditioning of the physical, of the temporal, the truth will be there, and then the ego will instantaneously filter it, change it, muddy it, and that's what you're going to be, coming back with. To be aware of that and always demanding more of yourself in your interpretations, attempting to be of the noblest, highest mental character in order to try to see past some of that obfuscation that you know is going on with yourself, to be aware of it, to hold that awareness, and then to try to work with it. That's the admirable goal. And sometimes you can gain that access with ritual work. If you're really lucky, absolute truth, unfiltered, undiluted, glorious, and terrifying will, you might just barely glimpse it. It'll make no sense when you re-enter the conscious physicality, your own body. It's at least not in your communications to others or within an interpretable temporal language set. You're not going to be able to communicate the experience of it to anyone else in a meaningful way. And you'll probably sound more than a little crazy, especially to most people, to the non-initiated. But mostly it's just going to be that the sense of what you were in the presence of can't be relevantly conveyed to others. You'll still have that sense for yourself. And that is a worthy goal. In audio scrying or simple smoke movement, is it coming towards you? Is it blowing away from you? When the leaves hit the sensor, do they hiss or do they pop? That's either nonsense or only useful in real magics if what you're actually doing is having already taken the time to previously set conditions into your own mind for those quote unquote answers, those, hissing or popping sounds, mean yes or no, for that to be relevant. Like if you're doing audio incense smoke scrying and you throw your resin on your coals and it hisses. Already in ritual conditioning to myself, what that's telling me is to lean further into reflection of my shadow for interpretation rather than reflection on the physical plane for interpretation. It could be used that way. If the smoke moves towards me and I've already previously conditioned myself ritualistically, symbolically, to have an automatic response subconsciously of, say, positivity and affirmation when it moves towards me, so that my interpretations of the symbols or patterns I think I perceive will arise from that cognitive preset, rather than if the smoke moves away, it means it's a negative influence. And again, remember, positive and negative don't mean good and bad in magic. But let's say it moves away and you've already preset the conditions in your own mind that moving away means, the negative pole. And then you're going to allow that cognitive preset to take dominance in order to affect your interpretation. Again, none of which is useful unless you're also intuitively inducing comprehensive work with the subconscious mind. And by its channel, by its avenue, by accessing that, all that lies beyond it. All that it lies within. It might be another way of putting it. Again, you'll see that the actions of the incense itself are just like a first level preset put in place for the deeper intuitive work to begin. So in that way, it can be used. Simple things like movement, left, right, towards me, away from me, ash curls. You could be using it magically, but you can't just be saying if the smoke moves left, it means someone will have a baby. If it moves right, they won't. Unless you've done conditioning work that's then led to that interpretation via the subconscious mind accessing beyond the veil, or unless there's an entity in the space moving the smoke around. And generally, you're not teaching it, your language of what means what. It's teaching you what the different movements mean. And you trust its intuition or interpretation of things, which again, I've been over. There's a whole different process involved there. And you have to remember, things not bound by time and physicality, like truth. Truth is a principle not bound by time and physicality, as are entities that you would call upon for knowledge. Those things are fully capable of giving full, honest responses that are also completely wrong from our perspective because they aren't bound by time and space. Keep that in mind. Anyway, movement, audio scrying with incense in that way of, say, pre-setting conditions for what a sound might mean or what a movement of smoke might mean, that's a lot like ceremonial sigil magic. It will have an effect, absolutely, but it's because you're controlling the parameters of that effect, directing them in a useful way, having conditioned yourself to certain responses when you use certain ritual objects or see certain symbols or interpret certain smoke movements. General stuff to keep in mind about all forms of scrying. Drink water, lots and lots of water. Cleanse yourself as well if you can, before. Ceremonial bathing, purity and ablution rites. Even just washing your hands on purpose, symbolically, ritualistically, every time before you scry, having someone pour water from a pitcher over your hands. And these things are going to help a lot. Eat after, not before. Much like when a coven gathers to do spell work or an Enochian magician fasts to perform high magics, when you're wanting to open yourself to higher, lighter, one might say, influences, it helps to do it on an empty or near empty stomach. Just kind of the same way that it helps to do yoga on a near empty stomach. It's safer, it's better for you, and it makes the whole experience easier. And you're less likely to get ill, and you're more likely to get more out of it. And then you can also use that wonderful act of eating afterwards to ground yourself after spell and scrying work. And that is very helpful after astral work, after any kind of ascension or divination workings, to remind your mind and body to come back and be here and be grounded and balanced and depolarized. Eating will help with that process after you finish scrying. If information you receive or a message you receive while scrying seems absolutely ridiculous or makes no seeming sense, it's probably very accurate. It's one of the catch-22s of magic. Again, you have to remember truth isn't bound by our perception filters. Conscious awareness and knowledge, time and space. None of that has anything to do with absolute truth. And a lot of the time, when something seems to be really ridiculous, it's a hint towards the path best undertaken, but you just can't see that yet. Because it's the butterfly wing, right? That leads to the tornado of causality, that domino effect that you could never, predict or follow in some rational way. So if you're scrying and the message is dyeing my hair will end the war, dye your hair. You don't have to understand it. Just whatever the meaning or the effect. And it could be years in the making. It could never become visible in an interpretable way to you at all. That doesn't mean it wasn't a valid scry. Generally, the really strange ones are the ones that have, I've found, the potential for the greatest effect, because they are coming from beyond a place of our current physical temporal interpretation. And that is why we perceive them to be so outlandish, so ridiculous. If you have an incense scrying session that makes no sense at all, the scrying that you don't understand the message at all, not that just that it's ridiculous or seems like a silly thing or an odd thing, but that you really can't pull anything out of it, gibberish, just wait, be patient, and don't dwell. Like all magic, it makes itself known, and it will. Or you'll clarify it at a later time if necessary. Or perhaps you weren't meant to understand it and you let it go entirely, and that's the best outcome. Not every spell needs to be beaten into submission. Not every scrying session will produce insight that you can understand. You're human, and that's the point. Again, you look back at Pythia, you see divination, prophecies for kings of, I think, Greece, the wind will be your greatest ally. No one understood that. And then it was like, you're talking about an element. I don't understand how I'm supposed to make friends with the wind, right? That's how a king is going to perceive that prophecy. But it was the wind that destroyed the fleet, that, there was a huge storm that took out a third of whoever was coming to invade them. So you're not always meant to be able to interpret it. Sometimes it won't make sense to you at all. That doesn't mean it's not the most powerful thing in the world. And it doesn't mean try to force it to make sense. Because you're making sense of it or not won't necessarily matter at all. It's going to happen anyway, so don't dwell on it. Again, it'll make itself known, or you'll never understand it. You're human, and that's the point. For now, anyway. So don't worry about scrying not working well, and don't judge yourself for it. A lot of divination messaging doesn't make sense. Sometimes the smoke is talking about the bird-headed purple people singing orange rose juices. Okay, so again, see, gibberish. Sometimes your HGA might drop that straight into your dome, right into your skull. That's the sentence that pops out while you're dealing with a querent. Or perhaps your spirit guide is mumbling it in your ear along with the tinnitus that always comes with them. You can't do anything with that. And you probably shouldn't try. You're probably going to create some really weird poison and try to feed it to a cult or something. That's not good, right? I don't remember what he said, something about, singing orange rose juice, right? It doesn't make sense. Don't try to make it make sense. That doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning or that it isn't true, but gibberish is tough to work with, even when you can keep your ego self from trying to put false reasoning onto it. And attempting to poorly force meaning on things is never a great idea. If you have no idea what was just said, even though words were involved, wait for more to be said. Wait for more signs, more synchronicities, more hints along the road, more power symbols to present themselves. Or wait for the divine, beautiful presence of silence and not ever getting more information on the subject, and know that that's divine providence. If you feel yourself doubting a divination, assume it's your ego obfuscating things. Like if you think you came back with information, but you immediately feel insecure about it. Oh no, I'm probably not right. I probably didn't do that right. That's likely the ego. It isn't doing it to be mean to you, right? This is Jungian psychology. The ego, its job, it thinks, is to protect you, and it's doing its job. But in knowing that, you can feel free in this instance when you're doing scrying work to let it know that you aren't currently in need of its protecting, insulating insecurities. And you can thank your ego for making you aware of your survival self, and then ask it to step aside so that you can trust your intuition during a scrying ritual. And you can talk to it just like that. If that's what helps, it's what helps. If your scrying results in questionable paths or multiple paths, or you're just confused, opt for the answer that's most demanding of your virtues. The most worthy choice. I mentioned earlier asking worthy questions in order to get worthy answers. That worthy choice can also look like the hardest road. Often it does, but that doesn't mean it's not the right one. There's that Freemasonic saying, I'm thinking of the Freemasons now. It's nobody told you it would be easy. They told you it would be worth it. So if the answer isn't obvious, always go high. Take the high road. Highest self, highest road, highest virtues to be employed. Courage, compassion, tolerance, patience, justice, fortitude, etc. The noble aspects, you're not doing them because they're good or whatever. It's because they will be the first to reflect new road markers, more hints and signs of how to best direct your course. Every time. And remember that often knowing something, and certainly knowing everything, actually would delay your evolution and possibly a lot of other people's. Often, no answer is the best answer. Gratefully accept information and opportunity when it is present, and gratefully and graciously thank Source when it isn't present as well. There's a reason. You don't know what it is, and you don't need to. There is great power in humility. It is an asset. If you get a scry horribly wrong, there's a million reasons it could have happened. And the most common is that you manage to deceive yourself rather than actually being open to intuitive source energies. It happens to all of us. It happens a lot. It's hard not to let it happen. Get over it. It's going to happen. You're human. And our propensity, our awesome aptitude for self-deception is without question. Right? It's going to happen, and it's going to happen more often than not at first if you're new to scrying. Mastery takes time. Just bare competence takes practice in this skill, in this form of high magic. So just know that it's going to happen, and that's okay, because that will still be exactly what happens as it's meant to be, as it's best meant to occur. Say thank you for making a horrible mess of a scried or divinatory message, and then walk forward again regardless. And I don't know if you'd call this the darker side of magic, or just the more relevantly less egoically attached. If you're asking questions like, is this person going to die soon? Is that person going to have a baby? Those aren't worthy questions necessarily, even if you think they are, even if you authentically, genuinely are sitting there thinking this querent, it's important to them to have this information, it would help them so much. And you think, therefore, it's a noble question to be asked and a worthy question. That is coming from a place of the ego. That is coming from a place of your own physical, temporal, very short lifespan and theirs. Knowing or not knowing if they're going to have a child and maybe never having a child, that might be the best thing. Do they want to hear that? No. Does divination want to give you that answer to pass on to them? No. It can be a waste of its properties. It can almost be insulting to magic to ask questions that seem so relevant to us that from a very simple another perspective aren't relevant at all. If that person doesn't have a child, someone else probably will. It's not going to affect, the the evolutionary state or even, the transitional state of their personal evolution, their family's evolution, their friend group's evolution, or let alone humanity as a whole. So even though it seems worthy, a lot of those questions aren't. They're just egoic, and you're likely not going to get very useful, very intuitive answers for things like that. Again, is that person going to die? Will they live? Will they get better? That's not always a respectful question to ask. Sometimes the respectful question is, am I capable of evolving enough to realize that death is not something I need to fear on behalf of someone else? Right? So it's step out of your ego. Always be asking yourself that question, is this egoic? And very real high level magics, occult oracles. One of the many reasons you're never going to see them, portrayed anywhere, even though they're happening, is people really aren't allowed to ask every little thing that comes to mind. Even the most, devout practitioners within a group that maybe has a good oracle, you aren't bringing those questions, to Pythia. Pythia only sees kings, right? Only sees the leaders of countries, only sees, the highest level druidic priest that's going to create the next 3,000-year religions that are going to influence humanity's overall evolution. Those are the people that Pythia is creating prophecies for, because their questions, if asked again nobly for right purpose, are going to be, the most useful overall. And that is what true high magic is reserved for. So again, you want to get better at scrying, think more about the questions you're asking. The more relevant the question, the more magic will respect you as much as you respect it and allow you valid insight. Until next time.